Thank you, Madam Chairman. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I bring before you Senate Joint Resolution 11, and I ask for your favorable consideration. This is an opportunity to express our responsibilities as a state legislature as the founders intended. From the founding of our nation, we have always emphasized the necessary relationship between the federal government and the states. Unfortunately, we have seen the expansion of the federal government without a counter mechanism to properly challenge it. The founders knew that the federal government would require future instruction by the people and wrote Article 5 into the Constitution for that reason. It is the ultimate expression of federalism, the division and sharing of power between the national and state governments. We have heard from our members of Congress on how ineffective our federal system is at correcting itself. Our good representative pointed out at the beginning of this session that we are about to hit a fiscal brick wall. Attempts to put limits on Congress from the inside have been futile, as restricting one's own power while in power goes against their own interests. Our former representative has commented on how powerful a factor fear is in making legislative decisions that could potentially affect the powerful. Additionally, our good senator came to speak to this body to remind us that the states have a superior, more effective form of government than the federal system because of the intense bureaucratic rules that dictate their ability to discuss ideas. The Founding Fathers intentionally wrote Article 5 to empower the states if the federal government needs to be checked by the states. It was brought out of fear that the federal government would grow to be oppressive and unresponsive to the people. It was brought forward and proposed in its current form, where notes say it was unanimous, not even an ironic no. Senate Resolution 11 calls for an Article 5 Convention of States limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for federal officials and members of Congress. And so if you look at the bill itself, you'll see on page 1, so it describes that this is a joint resolution, and then it goes into all of the different reasons why we're going forward with this decision, so the different whereases. And then on page 2, starting on 16, you see the reason, specifically what we're calling for in this convention. And so the section 1 says that the legislature of the state of Wyoming hereby applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States for the calling of a convention of the several states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for federal officials and members of Congress. And then section 2 talks about what powers Congress has over this decision itself and the relationship that Congress has with this convention. Section 3 talks about this application, and then section 4 talks about instructions to the Secretary of State concerning this convention. So this application limits the topics of this convention to allow for multiple proposals that restrain federal power. Of course, any proposals would have to be ratified by 38 states. 38 states. The Convention of States application has already been passed by 19 states. Wyoming has voted in favor of a Convention of States resolution 7 times in the past. So there is already statute concerning what Wyoming would do in a Convention of States, and that is found in Wyoming Statutes 922-102. What would the rules look like? So the rules would work the same way that our House rules work. Initially, the state that first called for the convention, in this case Georgia, temporarily gets to name the chair and adopt the temp rules, and likely that would be Masons, as 75% of all state legislatures use that as their base. And then they would work on permanent rules, such as committees, after they elect a permanent chair of the convention. So some of the basic rules are paramount. Each state gets 1 vote, so it's 1 state, 1 vote, which is the most beneficial system for the state of Wyoming. Each state certifies that their delegates are bound by the decision of their respective state, and the convention is subject to the germaneness of the applications that were passed to call the convention. Anything proposed outside of why the 34 states agreed to meet could and would rule out of order. And so Additionally, how would our delegation be selected? And so according to Wyoming Statute 922-102G, the Secretary of State shall notify the President of the Wyoming Senate and the Speaker of the Wyoming House of Representatives in writing of the need to assign delegates or alternatives to the Article 5 convention. The members of the Senate shall elect 3 members of the Senate to serve as delegates, and the members of the House of Representatives shall elect 3 members of the House of Representatives to serve as delegates. If a delegate becomes unable or ineligible to serve, the President of the Senate or the Speaker of the House shall assign an alternate for the delegate who has become unable to serve. An alternate delegate assigned under this subsection shall immediately be entitled to represent Wyoming as a delegate in place of the delegate who is unable to serve. And so again, I see this as an opportunity to positively affect our country, and I stand for questions.
Representative Stivar.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On and against. If you look at the Constitution, there's only a little paragraph under Article 5. There's no rules. We got to remember James Madison warned that those who secretly wish to get rid of our Constitution should push for a convention under the pretext of getting amendments. Think about that, guys. On and against.
Representative Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Got to be quick. I want to speak to, my name is on this bill, and that was a freshman mistake. I realized that after study. We don't have a problem with the Constitution. The Constitution, and the way it's interpreted, and people who follow it, or lack thereof, that's the problem. We need to just get back to where we follow the Constitution and where we interpret it the way it was intended, the way the Founding Fathers intended it to be. So on and against.
Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On and against. We talked about countermeasures to counter federal overreach. There are a number of ideas out there, a number of different things that we can do simply within the framework of the Constitution. We need simply make that work, and we can do that. But I want to mention that once this convention begins, there's no going back. The very first thing that these delegates would do to that convention is to make rules. And yeah, we go into this with the idea that we have all these ideas about what it's going to be. And some of them are good ideas. I mean, a balanced budget is an excellent idea. It's mandated here in Wyoming. Term limits is debatable, but I understand the sentiment behind the pressure to do so. This is not the right countermeasure, though. As I said, once that convention begins, it's not going to be undone. It's not going to be stopped. There are no predetermined rules. We have concepts, but just like the very first thing that we did when we convened here as the 67th Legislature, we adopted the rules. One rule that's been suggested is one state, one vote. How far do you think that rule would go in a popular vote among 50 states, including states on the far left coast, et cetera, et cetera? This is an extremely dangerous precedent. We can't go back from this. We haven't even tried seriously to fix those things that ail us within the framework of the Constitution. On and against, adamantly against.
Representative Ward.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. On and against this joint resolution. Supporters of the resolution are under the misconception that a convention could be limited to specific issues. That is incorrect. One of our founding fathers, whose initials are JM, refused to call for a second convention to incorporate the Bill of Rights. He said absolutely not. It would be too risky to reconvene. He correctly perceived that another convention would open a can of worms. He insisted the Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution in appendix format. 1988, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court agreed when he said, "There's no way to effectively limit or muzzle the articles of a constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules and set its own agenda. Congress might try to limit the convention to one amendment or one issue, but there is no way to assure the convention would obey. A constitutional convention would shake the very foundation of our representative republic. While conservative states would likely use a convention to try to reduce federal authority, liberal states would almost certainly use it to go after the Second Amendment and the Electoral College. A convention of the state should be avoided at all costs. If Wyoming legislators would like to change the Constitution, we could do it one amendment at a time, on and against."
Speaker Pro Tem Stith.
Madam Chairman, I think the representatives from Districts 12, 29, and 57 have it exactly right, on and against Senate Joint Resolution 11, for a couple of reasons. I think it's worth taking a look and reading slowly through Article 5 of the United States Constitution. The first thing that it says is that the Congress shall propose amendments to this Constitution on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So once the legislature passes this resolution, once we do this, our role is over. We've made the application. It's up to Congress then to call a convention. And there's nothing in Article 5 of the US Constitution that says Wyoming delegates have to attend. It just says a convention. We can go there and pound our fists and beat our shoe on the table and say we don't like what's going on. And if our delegates misbehave, we can recall them, but that doesn't stop the convention. Once we pull the trigger and apply for it, and if 3/4 of the states do, or 2/3 of the states do, then it's done. And then now you've got a convention, and there truly is no rule to control it. The only thing that a convention cannot do, there's only two things in the US Constitution that a convention of states cannot do. And they're listed right in Article 5 of the US Constitution. And those two things are, you can't ban the importation of slaves before the year 1808. Okay, you can't do that. And the other thing you can't do is to deprive any state of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So the only thing this convention, if called, cannot do is take away our 2 senators. After that, it doesn't matter what kooky rules we make up. We can make up all the rules we want to about how our delegates are supposed to behave, but it won't matter. So this is very dangerous. I love our Constitution. I love my Second Amendment rights. I don't want to see them dealt away at a convention of the states. The right not to testify against myself, that's important. The right not to have unreasonable search and seizures, that's important. The right to counsel. All of these rights that we cherish in our Constitution, all of them are at risk once you call a convention of states. So on and against.
Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to talk about rules and our compliance to them. We talk about we're going to have rules for this convention, and of course, everyone would follow those rules. I would suggest to you that that's false, and I'll use this very chamber this very day as an example of that. We are governed by the Constitution of the state of Wyoming. And in this very chamber today, we heard 2 impassioned appeals to apply our laws to the Constitution of the state of Wyoming. I delivered one, and the good representative from the 45th delivered the other. And we were both completely ignored immediately. Folks, we have way, way too much to risk. If you value the Bill of Rights, if you value your Second Amendments, go ahead and vote for this. On and against.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So on page 2 of this bill, line 2, it says, whereas the federal government has ceased to operate under a proper interpretation of the Constitution. So why is that the case? Have we allowed a situation where the Constitution isn't being interpreted properly, isn't being followed? The Constitution doesn't allow for this government overreach. The Constitution doesn't allow for a budget to be out of control. It's very specific in what should be allowed to be the taxpayers' money be spent on. And yet we already have this issue. What we need is to enforce our Constitution and its limits on power. And that's how we turn this situation around. It reminds me a little bit of a gal named Dorothy in a Land of Oz, how she went through this whole adventure, you might say, thinking that she needed the wizard to get home when she had the power in her ruby slippers the whole time. We already have the Constitution. That is our ruby slippers. That can get us home. One of our founding fathers said, the true constitutional use of correctional power is to inform and educate the people. That is what needs to happen. We need to make sure the people understand what our Constitution says, and the people will make sure that we uphold it. The people will ensure the term limits and vote the politicians that they don't agree with out of office, if that's what needs to happen. Another of our founding fathers said, neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. The Constitution is not the problem here. We have other work to do. Calling a constitutional convention is not going to fix the problem. On and against this bill.
Representative Winter.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In the words of a recently elected Congresswoman from Wyoming, the Constitution does not need to be fixed. The Constitution needs to be enforced. I'm against this resolution.
Question having been called, all those in favor of Chairman Harshman's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report, it do so with the recommendation that Senate Joint Resolution 11 do pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Senate Joint Resolution 11 has failed committee of the whole. Therefore, pursuant to House Rules 6-6B, having failed a voice vote, a standing division vote is required. All those in favor, please stand. Thank you. Opposed, please stand. More than 18. Having failed a standing division vote, a roll call vote is required. The chief clerk will call the roll.
Ellerman? Allred? Andrew? Wiley? Yin? Swanensor Dan? Swanensor Dave? Speaker Summers? Are there any changes? Storer? Closing vote? Vote closed. 21 aye, 41 no.
Pursuant to House Rule 6-6B, Senate Joint Resolution 11, having failed a roll call vote, is indefinitely postponed.